Hello, everyone, and welcome to Launchpad 21. I'm Judith Peterson, CMO of Cerulean Sky. In today's conversation, we sit with Colleen Fay, who's an experienced professional in the alternative investment space. Welcome, Colleen.
Hi, Judith. Thanks for having me today.
So, Colleen, what are you seeing in the alternative space? What are you seeing people launch?
Yeah, so actually, it's interesting. There's been a lot of activity this year, and much more than I would have expected if you asked me that question in April of 2020. The SPAC market has obviously been thriving and continues in the first quarter of 21 to be that way. Um, we've seen hedge funds are starting to launch in Q1 of 2020. I think they had slowed down a little bit, in the past 9 months leading up to that, just based on COVID-related restrictions. The venture capital space is definitely thriving, and we've seen a lot of new investment there. And then I'd say private equity probably falls somewhere in between the two. I think, in 2020, the investments that were made in the private equity space that we saw probably focused a little more on investing into managers that had an established background, so not as much with new managers entering the space. But now, with the outlook of return to in-person being a little bit more gray, as we finished out 2020, I think people are pivoting and starting to find ways to invest in those new managers and do the due diligence that they need to do in a remote arena.
Go into a little bit more detail about the focus within the kind of main buckets, I guess, that you mentioned. Could you go into a little bit more detail?
Sure. So I think what we're seeing really falls into two categories. There's the investing that we're seeing as a result of, being amidst a global health crisis, as well as an interest in focusing on ESG based funds. So under the health crisis, obviously, there's a renewed interest in health and wellness. So investments along those lines that we're seeing a lot of, as well as in the technology space. So technology has always been a good investment, but obviously with a country that, or a world that has to turn and pivot to remote and virtual learning and work overnight, investment in technology has continued to thrive. And then, interest in ESG funds, what that looks like for the funds that we've seen is an interest in investing in funds that are run by women as well as Black and Latin owners. And then in turn, investing into companies and founders that are women backed and Black and Latin backed.
That's amazing, and I'm happy for all the women, as it's women's National Women's Month, so that's awesome. Hopefully it's not a fad. What advice do you give managers, I guess, as they're launching?
Yeah, so from a tax perspective, we like to walk people through, some of the pitfalls and considerations that they need to be thinking about as they get up and running. It may sound obvious, but there's a lot of things that are easier to do the right way first, as opposed to trying to undo things that maybe had some kind of unintended consequences. And the other thing that we often advise to people is, whether it's a full-on CFO that works for the company or some type of outsourced arrangement with the CFO, having someone in that accounting role to focus on the operation side of a newly launched business is really important, so that the manager can in turn lend their focus to raising capital and their investment strategy and getting the fund up and running from that end.
Right. I mean, I always find it interesting that there are two elements to growth, right? There's growing your AUM, which everyone seems to be hyper focused on, but it's also a business that has to scale to that AUM, and focus on solid operations. So I think a lot of portfolio managers love managing the portfolio and getting investors, but there's also just the operations and the follow through and everything else. So that's amazing advice. So for someone who is, I guess if you right size that advice for some professional that's starting out in the investment management industry, what advice would you give to them?
So for somebody that's just starting out in the industry, I would really say to focus on building the relationships. It may sound cliche, but it's a small world within the alternative investment industry. Once you find that advisor that you really click with and that is able to grow with you, chances are, as your company builds and grows, you're going to need different services, and different things will become important to you. So if you've found that trusted advisor up front, they're going to be able to kind of guide you in the direction of the other things that you may eventually need, because they probably have their own network of other contacts that they'd be able to put you in touch with. And so I think it's really just important to focus on finding those advisors that are going to grow with you as an emerging manager, for the long term.
That's great. Well, Colleen, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciated hearing your insights, and I hope 2021 continues to be a great year.
Yes, thank you, Judith. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.